Thank you so much for joining us. And for those we haven't seen yet today, my name's Pippa Hudson, my co-host for this session, Actuarygpt to my left, and really happy to have you with us. I hope you enjoyed your lunch break. And just a couple of rules of housekeeping before we dive into the second round of our concurrent sessions. This one's focused on data science, just so you know you're in the right room. Firstly, please a reminder to have your cell phones back on silent. I'm sure everybody probably checked in with the office over the lunch break. So if you did so, please just pop them back on silent. We are going to be hearing from our speaker for roughly 45 minutes, and then we will make space for 10 or 15 minutes of questions at the end. We have got a roving microphone, so a reminder, if you'd like to engage from the floor, just raise a hand to let us know that you would like to ask a question. We'll bring a microphone to you, and please, it's really important you wait for that microphone so that everybody else can hear the question, including the guest and including those joining us on the virtual stream as well.
Thank you for that, Papa. It is interesting. I'm just trying to read the room and see how active and lively people are coming out of that remuneration session. You know, there are two reasons people go for the remuneration session by SA3. The first reason is those of us who may feel aggrieved and we feel like we are being underpaid and we want data to take back to our employers around it. The second reason are the employers, the bosses and the managers, to see who's going for that session amongst their employees so they can start addressing your issues properly. And that's not necessarily because of a salary increase. So we are going into the current session, and you will see we have back-to-back data science, machine learning, AI sessions. And if you are tempted to fall asleep during this session, I'll give you this quote that hopefully will encourage you not to fall asleep. It is by Mark Cuban. He said, "I am telling you, the world's first trillionaires are going to come from somebody who masters AI and all its derivatives and applies it in ways we never thought of."
You putting yourself in line for that, Katlego?
I'm hoping.
For two offers. I just want to say to those who are joining us virtually, again, please feel free to engage via the Q&A session function on the WebEx app. Also a reminder, everybody, that the sessions are all being recorded. So if you'd like to listen back, just revisit some of the points that were made this afternoon, they will be posted there. You can also visit the WebEx app for details on the speakers, for abstracts on their papers, and to engage with them directly. So if we don't manage to get to all the questions you have and you'd like to engage further, that is an option to use the app. Of course, you can also catch them physically at the networking session later today, if you so please. So let's dive straight into our next speaker. Great pleasure to welcome with us today presenter Cesar BALONA, who is going to talk to us about the concept of large language models and how they can potentially be applied to actuarial science. Obviously, potentially hugely valuable tools, but as all technology, they come with their limitations and with their challenges, which Cesar's going to discuss with us today. Welcome, Cesar. Great to have you with us.
Thank you. First of all, just a big thank you to everyone taking their time to come and listen to what I have to say today. I really appreciate it. And what I'll be talking on is how you can apply large language models in your insurance and actuarial work. So what you can expect to get after this session is hopefully an answer or some direction on the way to answering the question, how can we use large language models and hopefully be on a path to become one of those trillionaires. Before we get into the meat of the presentation, I just want to say that this presentation stems from a paper of the same name on the same topic. And if you leave this presentation today wanting a little bit more information, I encourage you to read the paper, which is available in the convention program or at the link at the bottom. This session exists purely to convey ideas, so share some of the learnings I've made when writing this paper, and hopefully spark some ideas in your minds as well on how you can leverage these models and use them in your day-to-day work. So having said that, I'll also state that I don't consider myself an expert in large language models. The reason I wrote this paper was, as they exploded onto the scene late last year and the rapid advancements we've seen this year, I felt it was important to understand how we as actuaries and as individuals working in the insurance industry, how we can leverage these models in our work and see what it means for us. What I'll speak to today, I'll introduce very high-level large language models and what they are. I'll go through some ways you can use them directly and indirectly. I'll give you some examples and case studies, and I'll also show you where you can find the code that I've written behind these case studies. And finally, some closing remarks on risk, professionalism, and what it means for our jobs as actuaries. Right, so large language model. What is a large language model? I think we've all been exposed in some way to large language models already. We've all probably gone onto ChatGPT, typed in some weird and wonderful things and been amazed at the output. And what you're actually doing when you're using that website is you're interacting with a large language model behind the scenes. So that website is just a portal to a large language model in the background, the large language model itself being called GPT. But then the question might be, okay, how do they actually work? And basically, they are a big neural network. And when I say a big neural network, I mean big. So you probably have seen such an image before on the right-hand side. That's kind of a typical neural network you might use in pricing or in other data science work. Maybe it gets a little bit bigger than that. But to compare the scale of a neural network such as that to a large language model, think of your HP12C, our old friend. If you consider that a normal neural network, a large language model would be a supercomputer, basically. That's the scale we're talking about for these models. They take months and months to train, tens of millions of dollars, so they're no small task. The big breakthrough of transformers, large language models, is that they use something called a transformer. And that looks something like this. So again, you might have seen this before, and it looks very complicated, but to distill it down, the key to them is something called attention, which basically means a better handling of the context of a word in a sentence. So the model really understands at a deeper level what a word means. So if you're talking about a model as an actuary, you know we're talking about a mathematical model. If you're talking about a model as a fashion designer, you're talking about a runway model. So the base idea, large language models are very good at understanding and generating text. So if that sounds complicated, don't worry. I don't think we have to introduce F109 or F110 or whatever we're moving on to now to use them. They are super accessible, as I will show, and immediately useful. So one way we can begin to access these large language models is through a website. And I've shown one of those already, ChatGPT. Go in, type your prompt, and hope to get a beautiful response back that makes your work that much easier. Of course, ChatGPT is not the only way we can access a large language model. We also have others, such as Llama from Meta, or one like Bing, typically used when ChatGPT doesn't cut it. And what these websites do is they offer very easy ways to get informal help from a large language model. And what I mean by informal is that you're just kind of interfacing with the model and using it to support your role. One example I have here is as a coding assistant. So what I've done is I've asked the model or prompted it, can you help me understand a Python library called scikit-learn? I wanted to fit a linear regression to some insurance data. And you can see it very nicely and beautifully gave a step-by-step guide on how I can do that. Recently, there was a plugin released for ChatGPT where you can actually upload data. This is very powerful. You can see here, I've uploaded the famous French motor third-party liability frequency data set, and I very rudely and abruptly said, here's some data, do some exploratory data analysis. And off that one prompt, ChatGPT generates some nice Python code. And within this code interpreter plugin, it actually runs that code for you, and we can see the result there. So I find this quite amazing. And in fact, very recently, they actually unveiled the ability to upload images. So you can take a picture of your cat and ask it, how cute is my cat on a scale of 1 to 10. So let's pause here and let's talk about this prompt. So I say the word prompt. Prompt is the instruction you give up front to the large language model. And that prompt I gave there is an example of a bad prompt. Why is it a bad prompt? It's very vague. It's not very specific to what I want. I just said, do some work for me. So it can pretty much do anything. And in fact, you might even get different results if you gave the same prompt to the model. You might get a different analysis performed. A good prompt, on the other hand, gives a lot more context. It's much more specific you are much more specific in what you want from the model. So here, I say, first of all, I'm an actuary. I'm working at a French short-term insurer. I have this claims data. I want to generate a report on claims experience. My main concerns are identifying regions and vehicles that are high frequency of claims so we can apply targeted interventions. And you see here, the response I get is very closely aligned to what I'm looking for. I get a list of regions and the number of claims in those regions. So you might pause here and think, okay, that's fine, but we know as actuaries that the number of claims, depends a lot on the exposure in the region. So maybe this is not exactly what we want. So there, I introduce now the concept of few-shot learning. And what few-shot learning is it's showing the large language model what you want, typically by giving examples or giving some feedback on its output. The feedback I've given here, I said, that's not bad, but I want to consider the frequency relative to the exposure. So instead of giving me the absolute number of claims, I want you to consider the frequency per 1,000 exposure units. What we get back now is the regions, but now we get the frequency of claims per 1,000, and you can see the result of the analysis now changes a little bit. So that's an example of few-shot learning. Everybody's happy. Okay, so 2 uses, a myriad of other uses: coding assistant, problem solving, drafting reports, education, tutor. The list is endless. One use I've enjoyed lately is typing in the lyrics to a song that I enjoy and asking for ChatGPT's interpretation, sometimes agreeing, sometimes disagreeing, and then saying, well, that's a great song. Do you have any other songs that invoke the same emotions and so forth? And it recommends me some songs. So another nice use case you could try. Okay, let's pause here and recap everything I've gone through. First, we've learned large language models, they are models tuned to language generation. That's their primary task. Websites like ChatGPT allow easy access to these models. And we can use them in various support roles, like a coding assistant. But the problem with this is that it's all very manual. You're sitting at a laptop, using a website, typing in your instructions. How do we actually embed this in processes so we get the benefit without having manual intervention? Enter the API. You may have heard this term, but if it's not familiar to you, it means Application Programming Interface. And what an Application Programming Interface is, basically an interface through which different machines can speak to each other and interact. Using this, you can write a program in one area and speak to a large language model in another by interfacing through that API and hence embed the model in your process. An API is like a post office, just to explain a little bit more, not like our post office, but a functioning post office, where You on the one end, or a program or a computer, you send a message, and that message is your instruction. You send it to an endpoint of an API. That endpoint takes your message, converts it to a format, or does some work that it can then pass through to the large language model. The large language model does its magic, sends the response back to another API endpoint, which you receive. Basic idea, you send a message, you get a response in an automated fashion. What this allows is programmatic interface with the large language model, meaning you can embed it in your processes. For example, as a claim comes in, perhaps it's in another language, you can set up an API or a program that will take the claim description in, automatically translate it, and you get back a translated version of that claim. Or, as I'll show in a later example, fetching news articles on a regular basis and distilling them into a summary or some report. And as we'll also show later, extracting structured detail from unstructured documents. Now, in the paper, I have 4 case studies that I talk through. The first one, passing claims. There, we take claims descriptions, transcripts from phone calls, medical reports, police reports, take all that information, distill it into a single summary, as well as maybe get a little bit of extra information out of those documents so that you get a summary of the claim that you can use later down the line. Identifying emerging risks. So searching for news articles on certain risks and summarizing that information. As a regulatory knowledge base, for example, we've all trawled through the FSI or the GRI to look for some information. Here, the case study takes all those documents, puts it into a database that a large language model can interact with, and you can type in a query and get an answer that is focused on those documents only, so it helps you to digest large knowledge bases. And finally, passing reinsurance documents, which I'll also discuss. Now, in the interest of time, I'll only speak in detail here about case study 2 and 4. But of course, if at any point you want to explore them deeper, of course, they're in the paper, but you can also go to the link on screen now and see the actual code behind these case studies and how I've written it up. Okay, so let's jump into case study 2. The task here is, well, first of all, what I want to demonstrate here is the ability to perform complex tasks by chaining multiple large language models together. So here the task is you are a risk analyst and you want to research emerging risks. And that means going on Google and searching for some news articles and then summarizing the main themes you identify in those news articles into a single summary that you can send to the board. But then the next step would be, okay, we've got the summary. Now can we extract action points from that summary? It's something that we can do with what we've learned. And finally, from those action points, also develop project plans for each of the action points that we can then carry forward and start actioning them. And all these tasks now are written up in a case study that can be performed automated using these APIs. So let's step into number 1. Searching for the news articles. No large language model involved here. Just a simple custom Google search engine where you tell it to search for certain key terms, cyber risk, GDPR compliance, so forth. And what you get back is a list of articles in the last 3 months. So some code to generate that list. No, nothing fancy yet. Once we have that list of articles, now we want to distill those articles into a summary that we can then take to the board or for whatever reason for reporting. And here we see some code where the prompt is basically saying what the task is. I tell the model that I'm a risk analyst for a large insurance company, and I'm tasked with identifying emerging cyber risks that could impact our business. I have collected snippets of a series of news articles. What I want you as the large language model to do is identify notable emerging cyber risks, themes, and trends, and list them. Don't name any companies or individuals. I don't want to get sued. Following this, produce a short summary identifying the emerging risks common in all the articles. The summary should be of a sufficient length and detail that a board member can understand the risks and opportunities and make an informed decision. So an example of a basically engineered prompt telling the model what I want out of it. So we take those articles, we pass it through to the model, and we get a nice summary. And you can see the summary starts by setting the scene of what emerging cyber risks are. For example, they include regulatory changes, technological evolution, cybercrime sophistication, increased digital platform use, and growing AI technology concerns. Goes on to speak a little bit more about it, and then in the last paragraph it says, well, the board needs to consider focusing on proactive security measures, incorporating AI responsibly, investing in cutting-edge fraud prevention tools, so on and so forth. So it gives us a pretty decent summary of all these 10, 20, 30, 40 news articles. Now the next step, we take this summary generated by one large language model and we feed it into another large language model. And here we say, I have this summary. What I want you to do is identify 3 action points that the board should consider in order of priority. List not more than 3 points and separate each point with a new line. Each point should be a single complete sentence. So you can see how sometimes you have to be quite specific with what you want to tailor your result to what you need in the next process. And then another example of few-shot learning, I say, if the summary states the board should consider cybersecurity providers, then the action point should be provide a high-level project plan to discover and evaluate cybersecurity providers, including information and how to evaluate them. Sending this through to our next large language model, we get a nice list of 3 action points. 1, formulating a strategic plan to continuously monitor cybercrime activities. 2, implementing a robust ethical framework. And 3, assess existing regulations on cybersecurity, so forth. So now we've chained together 2 large language models and gotten our list of action points. And finally, that's not enough. I'm a little bit lazy. I want you to do the project plan for me. So I feed in those action points, and I won't show the prompt here. I think the idea is there. And we get a very well-structured project plan broken down into parts. And I'll say that the formatting, the structure, that's all done by the large language model. So I'm sure if you've played around with ChatGPT, you'll see a lot of this is done for you. Okay. Let's pause there. It was a long case study. So let's recap what we've done. 1, we searched for articles. We sent it to a large language model to summarize. We sent that summary automatically to another large language model to list action points. And then, again, sent it to another large language model for project plans. And the key here, this was an entirely automated process, blazingly fast in under a minute. So I think demonstrating the value and the power of implementing these types of models within processes. Now, the next case study is on parsing reinsurance documents. And the task here, we want to extract structured information from reinsurance documents, such as contracts or treaties. So we have a fake example of a very simple reinsurance document, but I think we can all agree that often reinsurance documents, they tend to convey similar information, but they come in many different formats and structures, sometimes very long, and getting to find that those pieces of information that you want from it can be laborious and time-consuming. So wouldn't it be great if we could pass this document into a model that can pull out what we need? Typically, what you would have done before is written very manual rules that you define in code to search for certain terms within the document and pull it out. But the problem there is that you'd have to continuously update and change the rules as you get new reinsurance contracts that change in structure. So it's not very maintainable. Another option, you can train a natural language model to understand the detail in the document and pull things out. But again, not always successful. What's nice about large language models is that with their ability to understand context of a word within a document, they are primed for this type of task. So ideally what we want is a nice structured JSON format on the right-hand side where we've identified certain terms that we want, for example, like the treaty type, the insured, the reinsurer, start and end period, so forth. We want to be able to take a document and get that structured output at the end. Step number 1 is extracting the text from the PDF. Nothing fancy here. Luckily, these documents are often digital, so you can just hook into them with Python and pull out the text, and that's what this code is doing here. Once you have the raw text, you pass it into a large language model. And here, what I've asked is I've said I want the JSON representation of this reinsurance contract. But what I'm not showing here, you'll see that blue variable in the middle called system prompt. Within that system prompt, I'm specifying the structure of the format that I want. So I've said I want the treaty type, start and end date. I might want this arbitration clause, the hours clause, and so forth. Obviously, I don't have the values that I want to extract, but I have the general structure, and I've told the model this is the general structure. So with only the text, the general structure, you pass through the reinsurance document, and you can see the model has pulled out all the information quite nicely, all the different layers in a very structured format. And this gives you now the ability to automatically pull information out from your reinsurance contracts, validate them, check them against previous years, and reduce your manual workload quite a bit. Right. So once again, before we get into some of the final remarks, let's recap again. We've learned that we can embed these large language models into processes using that API access. We can perform tasks based on input, but also based on the output of other large language models. So we can chain together multiple large language models for complex tasks. And in the last case study, we saw that they can even extract structured output from various sources that are not necessarily structured themselves. But now, cue the actuary. What are the risks? With their power, obviously, large language models come with many risks. And I won't directly quote Uncle Ben here, but you get the idea. First of all, they have inherent flaws and biases. So we must remember that these models are trained on a huge amount of information from the internet that's freely available. And if you've ever spent any time on the internet, you know there's a lot of fake news, there's a lot of bias, there's a lot of stuff in there that you don't want to perpetuate. So of course, we need to be careful that we don't perpetuate these biases, and we need to critically evaluate when we're using these models and their use in sensitive applications. They might be very powerful, but they also have limited memory and context. What that means is they can only understand so much information, or you can only give it so much information before it starts forgetting things and it starts hallucinating and just practically being wrong. So you really have to limit how long a single interaction is with one of these large language models. So we must be careful to restrict how long we allow interactions to go for and put in monitoring for that. Of course, data security and privacy concerns, very big. We must ensure compliance with data protection laws, and transparent and explainable use of large language models is crucial. Question is, would you want your personal information to be sent into a large language model. So as an insurer, you should ask, should I ethically be passing policyholder information into these large language models? And that depends a little bit on where that large language model is sourced. And of course, ongoing monitoring and validation. So yes, validating and monitoring the output of the large language model and ensuring it's meeting its task over time. But importantly as well, if you are using a third-party large language model, such as one from OpenAI, monitoring their policies, their ethics, and what they are doing with their model to see if you are happy with using their model. And of course, you can address this risk by using local models without using a third party. Having looked at the risks, we then think about our professional responsibility as actuaries. One, our core responsibility is to ensure accurate, reliable information and to act in the best interests of the insurer and, most importantly, the policyholders. And this is no more true than with large language models. This raises some key questions and complexities. We need to ensure compliance with professional standards, managing these risks, and of course, avoiding unfair discrimination and adverse outcomes. Another big question is, who holds responsibility if something goes wrong? And my view here is that just like you use any other tool, Excel or Word, for example, you're using the large language model as a tool. So you must be happy that the output of that tool meets your standards as a professional. So again, risk mitigation is essential. Then the big question, what is the impact on actuaries? I think it will have an impact on actuaries. And the first of which is that we will have to evolve our skill set. I think actuaries must understand the limitations and the biases and ethical considerations of these large language models. We don't have to be experts in building them or training them, no, but we just have to understand what's important and how to manage our use of them. So we have to, in the coming years, no doubt, adapt to AI technology. It will be crucial for our profession. This then means we need to collaborate across disciplines. That means with data scientists and machine learning engineers who are the experts in these models, with ethicists where we raise those ethical questions and conundrums, and with engineers who help us build the processes where we feed data from one point to another. And we need to focus on data privacy, algorithmic fairness, and of course, transparency. What does this mean for our day-to-day job? I think it will change our workflows and our communications. Automation of time-consuming tasks means that we will have a much higher focus on complex reasoning, creativity, and of course, where we use large language models, we need to ensure we have effective communication of those outputs. Before I close off, if you're sitting here now and you feel you want more information and I haven't really addressed what you need, I encourage you to look into the paper. I give a detailed example of an inclusion of a large language model in the claims process, plus lighter examples in other areas. I also provide a decision tree to identify where you can use a large language model, and of course a risk assessment tree to guide their use. I also give a primer on how to use large language models in varying levels of complexity, the 4 case studies with the code that I mentioned, and what I hope for it to be is an initial step and overall useful reference guide to guide the use, or at least begin the use of large language models in our profession. So with that, doesn't want me to end. With that, I thank you and happy to take any questions and discuss afterwards.
Thank you so much, Caesar. We've already got a number of questions coming through on the app. I see a hand in the front, and if you would like to engage, please just raise a hand. Is that one over there as well? If we can get a microphone to the front, please. We'll start with the audience questions, and then we'll come to those coming through on the Q&A on the app. But please feel free to keep engaging by raising a hand. Let's start with the gentleman over here. Thank you.
Thank you. Nicholas Mazaidnote here. As far as I understand, the large language models that you're feeding this into are cloud-based, so they're available to everybody. The data, let's say the query assurance example that you feed into it, does the large language model then have a memory of that information? And should somebody else ask for something that refers to that, would the large language model be able to actually provide that data to them? That's just the first question. And the second one, what are the implications in your mind for the actuarial education in the process of examining students and assignments if they can potentially use large language models to help them in their answers?
Thank you. On the first point, it does again depend on how you access that model. If you access it through, for example, the GPT provided by OpenAI or ChatGPT, it's not clear whether in some area of their system it can remember and use that information in another area. So there, of course, the risk is if you don't know, rather be safe and don't do it. Of course, there is the option to opt out of them using your data for further training, but of course you never know if their wider use of that model allows that information to be perpetuated somewhere else. You can avoid that risk if you host a version of a large language model internally in your company, and you restrict it very carefully that every interaction uses a completely fresh spin up of that large language model, that once its interaction is performed, you destroy it. So obviously the next time you use it, it's completely new, so it won't remember anything there. So hopefully that addresses that question. On the second question in education, so I think there's two parts to this. The one in what it means for if students can use large language models to do assignments and to complete their tasks. I think that's a very difficult area to think about. Realistically, can you restrict them without sitting and watching them like a hawk in offline settings? I don't know. But in the second part, I think in terms of what that means for overall education, I think large language models bring such an amazing capability to improve learning, in that now with any problem you face, where previously you'd have to search and very laboriously try and find that very specific solution to your problem or that very specific explanation to your problem that might not exist, now you have this amazing ability to pinpoint and tell the model exactly, this is my problem, or if I'm working on a car, this is what I'm looking at, how can you help me? So I think we are at a point now where learning things like programming or any new topic, I mean, there's never been a better time in history to learn things. So I think in answer to the first part of that question, I think we should embrace it and not restrict people from the amazing capabilities they provide for education.
Thank you. We had a hand up over here.
Hi, thanks. Simi de Klerk from Old Mutual. I sort of want to extend the first part of the first question around the data security and maybe to make it practical. Like in South Africa right now with Poppy, could I actually send claims data with sensitive medical stuff into ChatGPT and hope for the best that they do what they say they're going to do? And then related to that, you mentioned running it locally as an alternative, but is the good stuff online and the one you're running locally, is it like not as good? Can you comment on that? And then finally, you mentioned hallucinations, and you mentioned that running a model for quote unquote too long increases the risk of that. Is that the only time it's a risk? Is it sometimes just wrong on the first response already? And how should you think about, well, I'm asking this thing, but it might just have taken mushrooms just before I asked it?
Oh, that's the next level of large language models. On the first point, yeah, better safe than sorry. I don't think we should just throw policyholder information into it. I think we need guidance and we do collectively think about what we should do. The second one, I think, just remind me, local versus cloud. So yes, unfortunately, the best models, namely GPT-4 by OpenAI, you can't get a local instance of that. You can access it, well, as far as I know, you can't get a local instance. You can access it in a restricted, almost restricted environment through Microsoft, but again, you are still at the whim of the policies of those companies. That means that the local models that you use, they are typically much smaller in size, which means they perform a little bit worse. I don't know off the top of my head which ones are the best and how they compare, but I know that generally the best performing ones you can't actually bring local. But I don't think that means, I don't think you need to use GPT, the best one. I think what's important is that you use it tailored to a specific task. So if you want to use it specifically for code, then there are variants of large language models for that are small enough that you can host locally. You also have the option of, to some degree, fine-tuning local models for specific tasks. And then the last point, yes, they sometimes are just wrong off the bat. And there's a lot of, I think it's very early days for large language models. The pace of development is crazy. And you'll very quickly see that sometimes, if you use them a lot, you'll see quickly they're just plain wrong sometimes. And you can very easily persuade them to be wrong. So that's not the only time that it's a problem. When it's a long interaction, sometimes they are just plain wrong. So again, ties into monitoring.
Thank you. We've got a question right at the back. While we get the microphone to the back, shall we take one from the app?
Yep, thank you, Papa. So we have a question, which should be a quick one from Thomas, who is asking, why do you need to use different large language models in case study 2 rather than just using a single one?
Okay. Yeah, good question. So the reason I split it up is because I want to focus the model on that task. So if I used one, just to clarify, I'm not using different variants. I'm not using GPT here and Llama there. I'm just using a different interaction with the model. And the reason I do that is I want my initial prompt to be focused on the task of summarizing. If I then pass it to another model and I quickly change and say, okay, now do the action point, yes, it can do it. But over time, as I mentioned, you can degrade performance. So the reason I split it up, I just want a fresh interaction with a focused task.
Thank you. Should we go to the question at the back?
Awesome. Thank you for the presentation and the paper. Out of interest, based on the sort of mushroom comment, for case study 2, if you ran, or did you sort of look at running that same thing a couple of times in the same day, and therefore assuming sort of news haven't moved much, like how many variants of summaries and action plans and project plans did you get? And also, did you run it after maybe a new article came out that you know should have moved it a lot and did it?
Okay. So I did run it a few times, and it does vary. The one thing I didn't mention is that when you use API access, you have a little bit more freedom than you do with the websites. And you can change some parameters, one of them being what's called a temperature parameter, and that guides how creative the model can be. If you reduce that parameter, you're forcing it to be a bit more strict in its response, and you can get to a point where it will be a bit more repetitive, so there's less freedom in what it generates. Yes, you run it multiple times, it will give you different answers, so I think a combination of tuning the parameter and being very, very explicit with your prompt and engineering a good prompt is quite important. The second question, I think, was on if articles have changed. So maybe not from case study 2, but I've done similar experiments on other news items, like just searching for weather events, for example. And there's two things, I think, to worry about here, and they're more related to the tools being used. So on the one hand, the Google search engine itself, not the best option to use because it itself, I think, tends to vary in the results that come through. So you have that variation coming through, and that will change the articles that you get. The other item is over a long time, specifically the ChatGPT or the GPT model actually changes quite a bit over time. So there was a paper released a few months back that assessed the performance of GPT in March versus August or something, and it actually identified quite a degradation in performance related to OpenAI trying to control the bias and incorrectness of the model. So there's two areas of variation to worry about there. One, your article's changing, that will change your result, but you should still get the general theme, and two, the actual provider changing. How to address the fact that things will change over time. I think if you want to use these models for a case where you're expecting a one-to-one output, so you don't want any variation in your output, maybe in a case where you're not even looking at the results, I think there it's a bit more difficult to use them because of the variation. But if you're generating output that you then take, analyze, and use forward, you can then adapt to what you get.
Thank you. I believe we have a question right at the front. While we're bringing the microphone forward, a comment, and I'll follow it up with a question. The comment is, it sounds like there's quite a bit of risk in determining when the LLM is hallucinating or forgetting, as well as in how one determines prolonged use. My question then is, how does one mitigate that risk?
So I think there's many approaches. One, you can control that temperature parameter to restrict its ability to be creative. Two, using very short interactions in very well-designed and well-engineered prompts can reduce that risk. And three, another option I haven't explored is, there's obviously the option of manual review, but there's also the option of another model, large language model, acting as 1 or 2 or 3 layers of review on that output. So I'm not saying these are the answers, and I don't think the risk can be completely eliminated, probably, possibly not, especially in the early days, but I think there are ways to reduce it, and I think that's why it's important to very carefully consider what use case we are using and if that risk means something bad for the output.
Thank you. Over to you, sir.
I'm Danny. I just wanted to find out, so, like in a society like South Africa where the data might have inequality issues and all of that, is there a way of doing like sort of some EDA on the data that the language model is using so that you can correct some of the biases in the output of the model?
The training data that the models are trained on. I think, so OpenAI and the big model providers, they are hopefully doing that. I think they are doing that in the background, not specific to regions, I think specific to general problems. So there's a lot of work they do to try and clean the training data to remove that, or change the training of the model to remove those biases. I think if you want to get to a point where you focus on a region, then that either means building a model specific for the local training data and using those interventions, or if there's the ability to partner with OpenAI and have a project where they can address that, that could be one answer. But I think the general idea is that at this point, it's very difficult to focus cleaning that data to a specific region. So it will have to be that you, at the end of the step with the output, manage the results.
Thank you. We've got another question at the back from the floor. Let's take that before we go back to the app.
Are we winning at the back?
No, thanks for the great presentation. I just have like 2 questions. So the first one on where you used that, I think it's case study number 4, where you used the model to like extract insurance information. So the function that you showed there is where you like sort of import PDF document and then you sort of extract text from that. From our use with ChatGPT, we know that it sometimes has like, or not sometimes, actually has a token limit. The way the code works there, wouldn't it get to a level where you run into trouble? Because if you have a long PDF document, then the model would actually fail to then generate a response. Secondly, given that way of sort of extracting text and the way the system prompt is sort of structured using a schema, aren't we also maybe gonna get to a problem where the model sort of hallucinates trying to pick up certain information from the PDF? Or maybe should we be looking at something like function calling for that?
So on the first question, sorry, just remind me the first one again.
No, so it was more that the function is extracting
the token,
yeah.
the token length, yes. So yes, most models have a very short token length or context window of the information. And yes, I think in most of the better performing models, when you get to a point of around 50 pages, depending on how dense they are, you're reaching that limit in some of the larger models. There are models out there that have much wider limits, so you can put in 1,000 pages and get a result, but they perform worse. So yes, you do run into that problem if your document is very long. There are some ways around that. One is in case study 3, where you can take a large amount of documents and you can vectorize them or put them into a format that the large language model can query against. And there it's not loading the entire document into memory, but it has some idea of what information lies where, so that when you ask the question, it goes to that area and it answers based on that information. Of course, it's not perfect. There will be limitations because sometimes you need to look at the breadth of the information. I think over time, there's a lot of effort to expand that context window, and that's probably one of the areas that the research will focus the most. On the second question, I think it was on the text and the model hallucinating. Just remind me on that one again, please.
Yeah, so it was more how the system prompt is sort of generated, the schema that you have, that given that you're actually taking a long text, won't we get to a situation where the model sees sort of excess of layer 5,000 and then...
Sorry, I can't hear.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, the mic's a little bit soft.
Can we just raise the volume a little, maybe hold the mic slightly closer to your mouth as well?
Okay. Is it better now?
Yeah,
Much better,
okay.
thank you.
Cool. So it was more that the schema, the way it's sort of defined,
Yeah.
and the fact that we're actually pulling a long text into the prompt, won't we get to a level where the model just sees an example, let's say excess of layer something, and then it actually picks that as the excess of layer sort of information, while actually that's not what you should actually be pulling up.
Okay, so will it try and force information into the schema?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes, I think that is a problem. And two ways to address that. One is in careful prompt design again. So you can say, if you don't find information, put it as unknown. Alternatively, you can put in a measure of confidence of the information. So maybe it put the excess of loss amount there, but it's only 20% confident. Then you can understand a little bit more if you should trust that information. And then another one is also having multiple models do the same task and combining and validating against each other. But yes, certainly an area to look or to be careful of. Thanks.
Okay.
We've got a question in the front here, if we can bring the mic forward. In the meantime, just a quick follow-up. You've mentioned several times now, Caesar, the importance of crafting the prompts very carefully. John asking, for the educational implications then, do we need to be introducing courses in crafting good prompts and how to identify bias in results?
Yes, I think definitely if we're going to be using large language models, I think it will be valuable to at least set a baseline of how to efficiently use them. One, that's taking a course on prompt engineering. Another option I have seen and I quite liked is designing your prompt, passing it into a model and saying, critique this prompt and tell me how to improve it, and let me know, ask me questions about how I should expand on this prompt. So yes, certainly I think we should invest in education, a short course on how to design your prompts. I think that's useful. And about how to identify bias, I think that's, again, quite a broad, complicated question. But but to manage appropriately how you use and interpret the results of that model outside of just good common sense in interpreting it. I think it is valuable to have more formal training to understand what to look for and how to identify bias. So I think both options definitely valuable. If you want to use these things, then I think definitely explore it.
The problem being that good common sense isn't that common.
Yes.
We had a question in the front. Welcome.
Hi. So, I just want to make a comment and then maybe get your feedback on this. But I suppose if you take especially something like a third-party model like GPT-4, and you embed it in a fully automated process, that aside from the fact that the model will obviously could change over time due to changes or updates that OpenAI makes, or maybe new rules it's introduced. But we also know that these models can go offline. So if you don't have a backup system, then you're effectively exposed to that risk as well, which is out of your control.
Yeah. I don't think that's a problem that's unique to large language models. I think anywhere you're using a third-party service, you're exposed to that problem. And I guess the answers would lie in just general redundancy and ensuring that you have the policies in place to handle that. I mean, a natural fallback, if you're in a system that translates claims or does something, it goes to a manual process for the duration of the time that the software is offline. But I think with the size and scale of these companies, they set up in such a way that downtime is very, very small. So although it is a risk, I think it's one that we can borrow from other areas, information technology, on how to handle it.
With 3 minutes to go, there's 2 questions I'm going to bundle for you from the virtual attendees. Peter Withy asked, noting that you highlighted the ethical considerations, and asked that from a large language model standpoint, aren't the professional considerations similar, or how do you find they are similar or different to when Excel first came into use, from an actuarial standpoint? And then another attendee asked a question around, is it possible to open the hood and have a view of what's going on to better correct the bias?
Yeah, I think you can draw a lot of parallels to the advent of large language models to any technology over time. So as Excel came in, of course, how you used that influenced the output, and you could do poor analysis in Excel. I think the big difference with large language models is Excel was a lot longer, more manual, more reviewed process where you actually involved hands-on with the model. So there was a lot more points to actually jump in and control the outputs and have appropriate levels of review. The power of large language models opens them up to abuse, that you can be lax and just trust the output too quickly because they act so quickly. So I think there are parallels that can be drawn, but I think the risk is larger for large language models. The second point, can you break it open and peer under the hood? That's a very difficult one because of the size and scale of these models. I mean, we've heard the age-old criticism of machine learning that they're a black box and they're very difficult to interpret. I mean, you multiply a model by millions of times in size. Peering in and understanding what exactly that model is doing, if that's even possible, I think is very challenging.
Do we have any? Yes, we have a question at the back.
Oh, I understand. But he was sitting. Hello, thank you very much for your presentation. I wanted to ask, I've had experiences with ChatGPT where maybe I want to write a research paper and I'm looking for references for certain topics. And then I can write a prompt 3 different times and then it gives me 3 different references. And sometimes half of them do not exist. So I don't know if there's a possibility also with generating articles, and if it's a situation where it is, and you have to verify all of those articles that you generate, wouldn't it just take less time if you just search for the articles yourself? Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, so the fact that it generates things out of the blue, that is a problem that I think OpenAI is working on. Again, I think one of the answers is using the API access and controlling the temperature parameter. In terms of the articles and generating articles in reference to case study 2, I think there we're limiting the ability of the model to generate articles because we are giving it a list of articles from which to draw its inferences from. So I think the risk there is a bit limited, but of course, a good old read and challenge of the results will hopefully go some way to avoiding that.
Thank you very much, Caesar. It's been an absolutely fascinating conversation and huge engagement happening on the app. We haven't touched on half the questions. So I just want to say if your question wasn't answered, please use the app to engage with Caesar or obviously grab him during one of the networking sessions to pick his brain further. But really appreciate your input today. Thank you so much.